Hello, this is Daniel Levy. I'm with David Frum, who'll introduce himself momentarily. So, hello, David.
Hello, Daniel. I'm David Frum. I'm at the American Enterprise Institute here in Washington. In fact, speaking to you literally from the American Enterprise Institute in Washington.
And I'm with the New America Foundation and the Century Foundation, also here in Washington. David, you just returned from Afghanistan, I understand. And I thought maybe we'd start by talking about that. And, well, in the Obama campaign sense, this is kind of the good war as opposed to Iraq, the bad war, right. Although no one seems to think that either are going too swimmingly. What was the sense that you got being over there?
Well, I was there for 8 days. I was there under the auspices not of the United States but of NATO. And that actually has some, although the person at the top, the general in command, General McKiernan, is commander of both U.S. forces and also ultimately of all NATO forces. They've got two different missions and they don't always play well together. One of the things that was often said, Daniel, in response to your point, is wouldn't it be ironic if the war that everybody hated and opposed was the war that turned out to be successful, and the war that everybody liked was the war that turned out to be a big disaster? Because Afghanistan is not going well, and unlike Iraq right now, where there are a lot of hopeful signs, there are very few hopeful signs in Afghanistan, and I think it's generally agreed that things are going to get better before they get worse. They get worse before they get better, if they do ever get better. Barack Obama is committed to increasing the American forces in Afghanistan. There's also a lot of talk about a diplomatic surge, and there are a lot of nuances as to what's going on. A lot of different parties have a lot of different interests. For example, right now there's a big push for early negotiations with the Taliban, or what are the so-called moderate Taliban. The war is a war of a coalition against a coalition. There are a lot of different pieces. There are a lot of people who are fighting for a lot of different reasons. And it's probably true that some of the people who are fighting against the legitimate government and NATO, the United States, are reachable. It's also true that one of the big motives that the Afghan government has in encouraging early negotiations is the insurgency is strongest in the regions where President Karzai has the strongest ethnic ties. And he's very worried. Afghanistan is supposed to have elections in 2009, that if those areas remain violent, they will not be able to vote, their vote totals will be reduced, and the parts of the country where he doesn't have ethnic ties will have more voting power and may then vote for somebody other than him, which would be bad for him. Not clear that it's bad for anybody other than him, however. And most of the NATO people think that negotiations later would make more sense. There are going to be more American troops, more firepower, and likely that the Western forces will be stronger next year than they are this year.
Let's stick with Karzai maybe for a moment. And you said bad. That could be bad for him. That particular election scenario, perhaps not bad for anyone other than him. How much support do you sense there is still in NATO and in on the American side for pursuing a very Karzai-centric approach to Afghanistan?
They've just. I had a funny experience. About 10 days ago, maybe 3. I guess it must be now 3 weeks ago. The New York Times had a big story, sourced like half a dozen different administration officials about the connection between Karzai's brother or half brother and the drug trade. That story appeared on the morning that we got our reception at the presidential palace, and they were an hour late on the Afghan end. And when they came in, they said busy day. Yes, I can see that. It was a busy day. I think the United States has very little further use for President Karzai. That's one of the things that is leading Karzai to be interested in dealing with the Taliban, that you can be on the outs with the Taliban and you can be outs on with the Americans, but probably not both.
Sorry, carry on.
They're probably not both. So I think he may be thinking about how does he pivot and have a warmer relationship with at least elements of the Taliban, because the Americans are about to pull the plug on him. Here's, I think, one thing that I would sort of suggest that Blogging Heads viewers might want to think about. There are at least 3 important elements of the insurgency in Afghanistan. One is the ideological Taliban. 2 are drug dealers. And 3 are the Pakistani military and police and intelligence services. It's not at all clear who's working for who. I mean, we often talk about this as if this is a Taliban rebellion, and they tax the drug lords, and they get about $100 million a year, it's said, from drugs, and the Taliban are in charge and the drug lords are subservient. Except one of the things you notice that whenever anybody comes up with any project ever that will encourage farmers to grow something other than poppy. The price of poppy to the farmer is, I'm told, not very high. In fact, they can make more money by growing wheat if there's water. There isn't water, so NATO tries to
I
build
think you
water
said
projects.
wheat rather than weed, but I wasn't sure.
Wheat rather than poppy. NATO builds irrigation systems. The Taliban attack them and damage them, and that forces the farmers back onto poppy. Well, who's working for who there? If you were to posit or hypothesize that this is a drug-driven insurgency, with some of the biggest drug dealers being high officials in the Pakistani state, they wouldn't have very different tactics from the tactics they're using right now.
And is that an argument that you found had traction? I imagine that's where you heard it from some of the NATO people who you were there being hosted by.
Yeah, no, there's a big dispute as to whether Pakistan or drugs are the biggest moving part. What everybody agrees on the NATO side is that without Pakistan and without drugs, the Taliban alone are not that formidable. But with Pakistan and with drugs, the problem becomes very difficult to solve. And not necessarily that it's unsolvable, but the question, and this is the question that will face any new president, is it worth it? How much is it worth to solve the Afghanistan problem? Because the scale of the investment would be very great. And unlike Iraq, the upside potential from both an economic and a geopolitical point of view of a non-failure in Afghanistan, people don't talk about success, but non-failure, the upside isn't that great and the cost is very large. And that's one way that it's very different from Iraq, that a success in Iraq, turning Iraq into a Western-oriented, stable, oil-exporting, non-aggressive country, that's a big win. An Afghanistan that's rises up and up and up until it's almost as good as Tajikistan, which is the second poorest country in Central Asia, that's maybe not such a big win for the Western world.
And is there any sense that a surge in troops could make much difference?
We're talking about 10,000 troops, a big country, almost 30 million people, and I don't think there is a sense of that, because unlike the reason the surge worked in Iraq to the extent it did, because the political conditions were right, that the Sunni rejectionists had ceased to reject, and also the Iraqi insurgency was primarily an urban insurgency. So you drop 10,000 more soldiers into Baghdad, and you make a difference, because although there are a lot of people in Baghdad, the terrain is obviously not that big. The Afghan insurgency is primarily rural. Kabul does not feel like a scary place. It's not like I was in Iraq in 2005, and Baghdad was just, you step beyond the wire and you're a dead man. Kabul people, the people who live, the Westerners there, they take taxis, there's a bar they go to, there occasionally is a killing, but there was one tragically just the other day of a UN worker, but it's not a place where you're locked up inside your base. The danger is in the countryside, and of course policing a countryside is very difficult, especially a countryside where there are no roads. One of the places I visited was the province of Uruzgan, which is policed by the Dutch. They've got a base, and there are two other major towns in Uruzgan. One of them is 42 kilometers away. It takes the Dutch 6 hours to get there by car. So, how do you control that?
But on both of these situations, and you've referred to Iraq, isn't this really about the need to find political solutions and how inclusive you're going to be with the actors, and that to the extent to which one can credit the surge with any success in Iraq, what it hasn't done is move that place closer to a political outcome that will give stability and that will in some way take Iraq forward, and you're essentially looking at something not too dissimilar in Afghanistan, and hence the talk, whether it be from the British ambassador in Kabul, Sharat Cooper Cowles, or others, about the need to actually talk with at least elements of the Taliban. And in both of them, yes, there's a military piece to this, but what you're seeing is a real incapacity to actually move the political piece forward, and which is another conclusion that I would draw from both, that this isn't easy to do when you've got a foreign occupation in both that's seen as hostile by many, and a lot of the focus becomes on opposing that foreign occupation. So that becomes an obstacle to actually getting the political reconciliation in either.
Well, that's a good on-ramp to maybe broaden our conversation a little bit, because I have to say one of the things that you do hear this a lot, more from people, especially from people in Britain, about the need for political solutions. But a lot of that ends up being a syllogism of the form of, if we had some eggs, we could make ham and eggs if we had some ham. That there is often, and I think this is one of my big complaints about the way people on the left-hand side of the spectrum talk about these issues, an assumption, gee, the only impediment to a negotiated solution is our unwillingness to talk to people we don't like. Because they're just lined up. They're ready to go. They want a political solution. They want to talk to us. They have no possible interest in this violence.
I think the position is more that is our military presence there helping you to get to a resolution, or is it becoming another muddying factor in making a resolution, a political resolution, or at least, maybe resolution is the wrong phrase, or at least a political standoff that is less damaging, can somehow assume a stability of its own? Is it making that more difficult to reach? I don't think anyone's naive enough to say that everyone's like just dying to get on with each other, and if only we'd let them and agree to have everyone in the conversation rather than just choosing our winners and the people who we're willing to include in the conversation and exclude others from the conversation.
Yeah. Well, in Afghanistan, we did sort of a real-life experiment on this question in the 1990s. And we found that in the absence of a Western presence, the various ethnic factions in the country just fought themselves to a complete standstill until the Pakistanis intervened in the middle 1990s, helped to broker this new creation called the Taliban, who were able to bring something like order to the southern two-thirds of the country, but at pretty horrific prices. Now, at this point, the Taliban surely cannot win because the Western countries have built a reasonably effective Afghan army that's very heavily seasoned from the north of the country. You meet the army people, you take one look at them, and they're Tajiks and they're Uzbeks. There are some Pashtun private soldiers, but the higher-ups and the units that are really keen to fight, for them this is as much an ethnic struggle as anything, and they've now got the guns and the training. The Pakistanis can't be as overt in their support for the Taliban anymore, although they are still the main supporters as they were back in the 1990s. So
doesn't this sound a lot like Iraq, where we're arming up minorities, as with the Awakening Council, and now the situation you're describing with the Tajiks and the Uzbeks in Afghanistan?
In Afghanistan, everybody's a minority. It's just that some minorities are bigger than others. So the Pashtun are also a minority, but they've been the historically dominant minority. What I hadn't realized, by the way, until I'd gone there, was that Pashtun are relative newcomers. That is, they have sort of been moving their ethnic bases in sort of the hill country, and they have been moving then gradually into the flatter and more valuable country. And that Afghanistan has become more of a Pashtun place. And that historically, the parts of Afghanistan that were of any value were Persian-speaking, and places like Herat, and Zoroasters apparently came from what is now northern Afghanistan that was then part of the Persian cultural zone. But anyway, yeah, that's what we're doing. In order to build an army, we've been relying on people to join the army, and the people who want to join the army and the officers who are willing to fight have tended to be from the north, the anti-Taliban people, and no question there are ethnic divisions in that society.
But is the American role, is the Western role to make sure that the Uzbeks and the Tajiks have their fair crack in terms of also being armed up, or more to the point, what's the mission there? Now
beats the hell out of me. That's the. I mean,
wasn't the idea that the Taliban was problematic in terms of global standards of governance, democracy, and human rights, but no, not necessarily any more offensively so than the regime in Burma, for instance, with the one exception: if they were going to harbour people that could do harm to the West. And so, shouldn't the focus really, from the get-go, and is it worth considering today again, be a much more narrow focus?
That's a question a lot of people are privately wondering, and there is not a lot of enthusiasm anywhere for this Afghan mission. And by the way, the question you ask is the same question that Donald Rumsfeld asked. I mean,
me and Don are always
overlapping again with him. I mean, that the view of a lot of people independent. One of the motives behind Iraq was, we don't want to get bogged down in Afghanistan. We can't fix this problem. So let's go in there and kill bin Laden and get out as quickly as possible, leaving it to subside into chaos. And again and again and again, the question was asked, what are we doing here? And I think the real answer is, well, because we didn't get bin Laden, we then, just as with Iraq, we went in to get WMD, didn't find them, and so stayed to build democracy. In Afghanistan, we went in to get bin Laden, didn't find him, and stayed to build a stable Afghan future. But in both cases, the first goals were very realistic and plausible. They just happened to be missed. And the second goals turned out to be very large and ambiguous and difficult to achieve.
Right, or whether the goal in Iraq was ever one that could have was it based
the
on
original
a
goal
false premise?
It was to get rid of the WMD. That could had they had WMD, we could have got rid of it.
Right, there you go. That was somewhat predicated on a somewhat problematic premise.
Well, let's maybe on that sort of paradoxical note shift to talking about the new Israeli government, which you've been paying a lot more attention to than I have.
Yes, which doesn't exist yet, of course. The person who's tasked with forming that government is Tzipi Livni, who is the head of the Kadima party. She won the primary election in that party, and she's just recently requested from the Israeli president a 2-week extension. She has until the day before election day here in the United States to present a new Israeli government to the Israeli Knesset. And she has a deal already with the Labour Party and with a smaller faction known as the Pensioners Party, and it seems that she will now be capable of forming a government, either, which is far from being the preferable option for her, either a minority government or bringing in one or two of the ultra-Orthodox religious parties in Israel, Shas, for instance, to form a government that would be a majority and more of a working coalition. And I have to say, not a lot is really being told to us by the platform that she's working on for that government. I mean, it really doesn't say very much. The major outstanding negotiating points are budgets for additional child allowances for families with a large number of children, because that matters a great deal to the constituency of this ultra-Orthodox party, Shas. So we're not actually getting much of a sense of what that government would do, other than, in general, what we know about Livni and what we know about her coalition allies.
Mm-hmm. Well, is Israel touched much by the international financial crisis? I know they've had this extraordinary boom in their financial markets. Is that part of what they're facing, that they are also enmeshed in these problems of credit and the inability to and the inability of especially small states, to guarantee their financial sector adequately?
Yeah, I mean, there has not been a bailout of the banks yet in Israel. The Tel Aviv stock market has suffered really rather similarly to stock markets around the rest of the world. There's the beginning of a sense of concern if money is withdrawn by some of the most important Israeli industrialists, and just the general sense that Israel is going to be part of the global recession, at a minimum global recession that everyone is now experiencing and expecting to get worse. Economic policy debates never figure that highly in terms of Israeli public discourse and election outcomes in Israel. There is though the beginnings of a dividing line between Netanyahu, who's the leader of the opposition and very likely to be the key challenger when Israel does go to elections, and is strongly positioned to do well in those elections. On the one hand, him presenting himself as the experienced, most economically seasoned, knowledgeable person.
Which has the advantage of, the additional advantage of being true.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And no one's going to... Where the flip side to that, though, is, of course, he would be seen as part of the deregulatory trend that may have gone... I would argue has gone a significant way towards causing this problem in the first place. But, like I said, that debate isn't really happening in Israel, although it is kind of an issue that Livni has little by way of economic background and experience.
What is the debate that is happening?
the debate is mainly over personalities, unfortunately. To be honest, there's not even that much of a debate over what they would do in the context of Israel's relations with the Syrians or the Palestinians. I guess the two things that you could say is a lot of this is about Livni and Ehud Barak, which is really boring. He's the Labour leader, and it's whether they can work together or whether they both have an interest in undermining the other one in advance of elections. So how ugly a cohabitation this will be if Barak is the senior ally in a Livni-led government. The other one that's perhaps a bit more interesting is Israel beginning to adjust to a reality where it is very likely that a new US administration, especially if it's led by Barack Obama, would be in a place of trying some kind of dialogue and engagement with Iran. And you're seeing the beginnings of quite a lot of commentary in Israel on what will be the Israeli response, how Israel adjusts its positions accordingly. Which has got much less to do with the formation of a new coalition in Israel and much more to do with how Israelis are analysing the situation here in the US. And for those who were still thinking that this might be an issue, serious poo-pooing of an October or a November or a December surprise vis-a-vis Iran coming from Israel.
Yeah, well, I think we've had our October surprise. It was the collapse of the credit markets and the nationalization of the banking. You don't get a bigger surprise.
You thought that was enough, yeah?
Yeah, that was quite a surprise, and probably a determinative one. As Blogging Heads viewers may or may not know, I have been writing now for, 5 years, that I thought, 4 years, that there's almost no possibility of an American attack on Iran, and people keep saying to me, well, there's still, 90 days to go, but it's not going to happen. I mean, none of the predicates are in place. There are a series of things you have to do. I mean, at this late date, it's sort of obvious. I've been urging this point for a long time. For better or for worse, it's not going to happen. I'm
well, I think to the extent to which some people posited the possibility of that being done by Israel, I think that's also very much off the agenda.
And I wasn't. Government.
Well, exactly. I mean, for one thing, you can't do it if you don't have a government, and it's not the kind of thing a government does in its first couple of weeks in office. And I also think that I thought this all along. I thought that those who felt that the Israeli government would do it and stick a finger in the eye of an incoming American president, that tends to not be how Israel operates vis-a-vis.
So you've got the odds are, we don't know who the president will be for sure, but the odds certainly do favor a Barack Obama presidency with probably a big Democratic majority in Congress. So it's going to be a very ideologically self-confident presidency. It's going to have a lot of room for maneuver. It's going to have a very weak opposition, at least for a year or two. So it's got a lot of opportunities to do a lot of different things. But no government has the opportunity to do everything. There's always a limit to the presidential time, presidential energy, presidential focus. And the record of successful presidencies is they start off with a very short menu of things they want to do, and only later do they expand. So one of the questions is, how much energy do you think an Obama presidency would devote to the Israel-Palestinian issue? My own view on Iran is, if they do anything before the Iranians replace their president in the summer of 2009, they'd really be suckers. But maybe they're suckers.
Look, I've written about this, and I kind of came out with the same position on Iran in terms of not doing anything that would play into the hands of Ahmadinejad in advance of a presidential election, given that I don't think any of us have a particularly good track record on being sufficiently sophisticated in calibrating what we do that will affect election outcomes in the ways that we want to, and we tend to end up scoring own goals on that kind of stuff. Yeah. Therefore, I think, yes, it's the first few months is really a process of review and waiting, perhaps sending hints as to the, which wouldn't particularly need to be sent because everyone's expecting it anyway, as to the American willingness to engage in dialogue but not to do anything that Ahmadinejad could be seen. But
isn't it true that he's like, what, the vice president or the press spokesman, maybe. I mean, he's like he's not really running the country. It's the same
Well,
evil
absolutely.
guy who's been running it, since the death of the Ayatollah Khomeini, right? I mean, Khomeini is the real boss. He wants this conflict. He wants it for his own reasons. What else is, why else would anybody, what other claim to power does he have than having a bad relationship with the United States? Certainly not economic management.
Well, I'm not really sure that that's his key claim to power. What I do think is that because things have been so focused and personalised around Ahmadinejad, that even though he is not, as you say, the ultimate arbiter there, or the person who would be most relevant in an engagement, I do think that it has made that engagement even more difficult because of how radioactive he would be. So even if he's not the guy, I think things would be. Let me put it as follows. I think in terms of the sellability and the acceptability of this on the American and Western side, it's a lot easier if he's not there. Whether that makes the negotiation easier. Sorry.
Doesn't it make this... Aren't you repeating here the same thing that I cautioned you about with Afghanistan? Which is there is this assumption that all that is needed, that the obstacle to an open American engagement with Iran is America. And that there is a tendency on... I think of people on...
I think...
Processing, I'll surrender the talking stick. Let me finish this one sentence. The people in the peace processing industry do have a vested stake in believing that we are the actors and the other guys are responders. That we decide and they react. If we are willing to talk, of course they'll be willing to talk to us. And the quarrel is something that is the product of our neuroses, not of their serious estimate of their own internal needs.
I'd rather be in the peace processing industry than in the war industry, but I don't think that's the case. I think, look, it's almost very simple that if there's no American side to this, then of course there can be no attempt to find a political solution. And I think the argument is that the placing of preconditions in the way of trying to thrash out political issues between two sides is not an effective way of going about things. Now, the very act of removing preconditions and of indulging in engagement, does that immediately mean that everything's going to be dandy and very easy to resolve? No, but it means you have a whole lot of other pieces in play that you can use, and I think that's where there's this, or at least where for me, the idea that you don't do diplomacy, it's appeasement and all this other nonsense really makes no sense at all. I think that goes more broadly. I mean, I think if one wants to, if you want to look at what get the Iranians looking around themselves and feeling perhaps less buoyant about everything, there's several things that one can do that go beyond a simple binary of stepping up sanctions and preconditioning engagement.
Name them.
I think if you have an American engagement with Syria and an America that's working with Syria...
What do you mean by an American engagement with Syria? Be more specific.
Well, I think America should be back in the business of building its bilateral relationship with Syria and testing Syria from a position of we've got things that we have shared concerns. What are you worried about?
Specifics.
Specifics?
What do you do? Do we still...
Send an ambassador back. Send back an ambassador.
Send an
First
ambassador.
and foremost. Look at what's going on with the Syria situation vis-a-vis Iraq, the Syria situation vis-a-vis Lebanon. Be supportive of the Syrian-Israeli peace talks. I mean, there's a whole load of things that one can be doing to test where one can go in the relationship with Syria.
Stop you, Daniel. Stop. You go way too fast, and you step over all the tricky parts.
Let me make my actual point.
Daniel,
let me make my actual point.
Hariri murder is forgiven, right?
I didn't say that.
Well, then why are we sending our ambassador back?
But let me make my actual point. I think that if you're in that process of testing things out with the Syrians, that's going to make Iran at least rethink a little bit some of how it's positioning in the region. So now you can carry on about the Hariri
You go
tribunal.
way too fast. You skip past. It's back to ham and eggs. If we had ham and if we had eggs, we've got the open dossier on the Hariri murder with Syria. So we're going to proceed with our Syria relationship. So what do we do about that?
Well, that is being dealt with in its own track, and I would say let that carry on being dealt with in its own track.
The own track is at the UN. So we remove it from the bilateral U.S.-Syria relationship. It's forgiven. It's off.
Well, I don't know that I said the word forgiven. I don't see that it's.
It ceases to be an impediment.
By continuing to say that this would be an impediment, what is America gaining from that? That's what I'm trying to understand. What's the outcome that you expect to see happening with Syria by saying, okay, we're going to continue to freeze the situation exactly as it is until the Hariri situation is resolved?
But when I said to you, I want you to explain what you would do, and I want you to be specific and not to step over difficulties, you can't say, well, these other difficult, but there are difficulties attached to others. So let's just go through your plan, the Levy plan, and step by step, and don't go so fast.
There's an ongoing process in terms of dealing with the Hariri Tribunal. That process goes on.
Okay. And
now,
when the UN finds that the Syrians killed Hariri, as we all know they did. Well, but we've got an American ambassador there.
Yes. First of all, I mean, I wouldn't want to preempt what the UN finding is, and I wouldn't want to preempt at what level, if they were to find any Syrian complicity, at what level they would find that complicity, and how Syria would then deal with and resolve that. It may be that all the people that the UN find were involved have magically disappeared already. So I don't want to preempt what's gone on there. I mean, yeah,
you also know the
West made a deal with the Libyans over Lockerbie.
Yes.
I don't know whether that was a good idea, whether that was a bad idea. But if one is saying...
But the Libyans did make a formal act of contrition, and they paid the victims.
I doubt that would be the outcome on Syria and Hariri.
I think that one of the things that you've got this great point of aperture on these. You've been involved in negotiations before, and I think it would be helpful if you sort of, when you walk us through them, not in this high level of generality, but on a specific level where these things suddenly become, a lot more interesting.
Look, I mean, let me put it bluntly. Israel, for instance, has decided that it is more important for it to have a degree of predictability on the security of its northern border, and feels that by engaging Syria, it begins to get a higher degree of predictability than by conditioning everything on the Hariri assassination and the outcome of that tribunal.
And Israel doesn't have a lot of interest.
I think that makes sense.
Israel doesn't have a lot of interest in an independent Lebanon. Are you saying the United States should take that same view?
No, but I think one has to be cognizant of what one means by an independent Lebanon. Personally, I do not have any great filialty to the Cedar Revolution, nor to the Fatah movement. And that guides some of my views on what one needs to be doing both in Lebanon and on the Palestinian side. I think Israel needs to look out for its interests, and I think the US needs to look out for its interests. I think to the extent to which... Let me make the point here. To the extent to which one can lock Hezbollah, for instance, more into a domestic Lebanese political arrangement, and at least place in front of Hezbollah the more stark choice between, are you serving a Shia Lebanese interest or are you serving an Iranian interest? I think that's actually better for America, better for Israel, better for the potential outcome in Lebanon itself.
But there is... Sorry, we tested that already. That's what the war in May was all about. We know the answer to that question. Hezbollah is a total arm of Iranian foreign policy.
I understood the war in May differently, but anyway.
People who are serving the interests of the ethnic Shia community do not start a civil war because you fired the airport manager at Beirut Airport. Hezbollah, what Hezbollah is very visible and apparent. And I just want... You've got now a multiple move. We haven't even gotten to the Palestinians yet. A multiple move toward Iran that begins by basically allowing the Syrians to continue what happened with that.
What I'm saying is, David, is there are choices.
Independence.
No, what I'm saying is, David, there are choices. Is the most important prism through which we see Syria the Hariri Tribunal prism or the strategic Middle East map Iran prism? Now, it's legitimate to say it's the former. I'm just saying that we've got choices.
They're not,
personally,
they're not
I
so
don't
easily
think it's
separated.
the former.
They're not so separated. It is
I
very
think
hard
they
to
are.
believe that a regime that would carry out an act like the Hariri killing, that is a statement about the character of the regime. I mean, they provided you with some strategic intelligence there. That they used not only that terrorism is a tool, but what their ambitions are for the region. And this goes back to the question of how do we make. And I'm for negotiations. My problem with peace, you had a amusing joke a little while ago, but it's better to be part of the peace process industry than the war industry, but they're not so easily distinguished. I mean, badly conducted or naive peace processors cause wars.
I absolutely agree. I think Annapolis is terribly
We saw that in 2000 with the Intifada, when a peace process caused the Second Palestinian Intifada.
I think that's
too
too
simple. The peace processing industry has had other dangerous consequences.
I think that's way too simple in terms of its analysis of the Second Intifada. But here I totally agree. I think we've not talked about it yet, David, but I think the worst thing an Obama administration could do would be to keep the Annapolis process going as it's currently structured. And unfortunately, I think the most likely thing they're going to do on the Palestinian track is say, we're going to act like the Bush administration in year 7, not in years 1 to 6. And we're going to, because we're diplomatically more sophisticated, we're going to have more success in building Palestinian institutions and in building Palestinian security and improving the Palestinian economy. Here I agree with you. I think there's a way of continuing with a dead-end peace process that is actually dangerous. But I think you are moving to a different point.
No, I want to hear more about that. Tell me more about that.
Look, I think the jury is in on the capacity to incubate Palestinian state building under the current conditions where Israel is in the territories, where Israel has a settler population to defend. I don't think you can incubate Palestinian statehood like that. I think you're going to have to get a deal and incubate Palestinian statehood under very different circumstances that will probably require international oversight rather than intrusive Israeli presence. And I'll give you an example. The security forces that America is currently working on training and improving, and I can understand why people are doing that, and there's Palestinian PA encouragement to do that. My fear, and I think it's a genuine fear because it's happened in the past, is that those Palestinian security forces will find themselves increasingly in the situation whereby they either have to defend their own people against the Israeli army, against the settlers, which means going into a confrontation with Israel, or they lose all credibility with their own people, and therefore what you're going to probably see is these Western-armed and American-trained security forces eventually turning those guns on Israel. And I'm not too enamored with that prospect.
Okay,
and
now
I
let me stop you there.
Part of a mistaken approach.
This time, instead of saying, I didn't want to interrupt you saying you're going too fast or you're going too fast, but I now have to rewind to the part where you started going too fast. Tell me again about how we're going to incubate Palestinian statehood under international authority. What do you mean by that?
Okay, what I mean by that is that what you have is a defined border. What you have is the Israeli withdrawal to that border of its military and the withdrawal of its settlements. Now, Israel's concern is that once Israel withdraws, a security and governance vacuum is left behind, which negatively affects Israel's security. And therefore, Israel, other than territorial aggrandizement, which for some people is a factor, but certainly not for everyone on the Israeli side, other than that, the reason that you have a continued Israeli presence is that first the Palestinians have to show that they can do this governance and security while we're still there. And my argument would be the Palestinians aren't going to be able to do that while there's still a hostile foreign Israeli occupation. The alternative would be that a non-Palestinian actor or a non-Palestinian set of actors provide those guarantees on what happens on the other side. They fill those security and governance potential vacuums. So I think that's European forces. I think that's some American leadership. I think that's some Arab role. There may even be some kind of need for a UN international mandate and oversight in the area that slowly builds towards full Palestinian sovereignty. But what I'm saying is at the moment we're locked into what I see as an unwinnable dynamic where the Israelis are saying, first of all, you prove yourselves. The Palestinians say, well, we'll try, or we can't while we're under your occupation, and it doesn't go anywhere except erode people's confidence and belief and hope, and it erodes the very capacity to get to a two-state solution. And that's why...
You remind me, back in the days of solidarity in Poland in the 1980s, the Poles had this joke. There were two solutions, they would say, to the problems of our country, the pragmatic and the miraculous solution.
I didn't hear the second one.
What?
I didn't hear the second one.
Okay, the pragmatic and the miraculous.
Oh, okay.
And one solution is that the Madonna of Czestochowa, armed with all the agents of angels of heaven, would descend and use divine power to solve all of our problems. That's the pragmatic solution. The miraculous solution is the communist ... So, can you tell me that your solution for the security in inside the Palestinian areas of Israel is to have...
Wait. Did you just call the West Bank the Palestinian areas of Israel?
Yes. That you have an EU force for which there will be no volunteers.
David, you've made it easier, not for me, but for Palestinians at least. If these are the Palestinian areas of Israel, just give the Palestinians the vote.
Next problem. No.
Yeah. Don't. Let's turn the tables now.
Mm-hmm.
You've suggested that my suggestions are somewhat miraculous. Let's make it very, very simple. If these are Palestinian areas of Israel, they're Israel. Just give the Palestinians the vote.
Yeah, no, they can't have that.
So you want apartheid?
No, I want what I want to do is I want to hold out that Palestinian independence is available
inside what you're calling Israel.
What?
Inside what you're calling Israel.
Yeah, it's inside. I mean, it's the territories are run by Israel. This is the Israeli zone right now. But the Palestinians can have independence. They have to put together a functioning government. That's their responsibility. And the EU won't do it for them. Anyway, the EU can't because the EU won't. They're not going to send troops inside the West Bank. That's absurd. I mean, they're not going to do that.
Actually, the EU are actively discussing at the moment. But
they're actively discussing it. But we'll wait for the list of volunteers. As for having UN forces, the UN has a long and undistinguished record of peacekeeping.
Wait. The UN role that I talked about was administrative oversight, was not in the security arena. I agree with you on that.
Okay, and the UN also, by the way, is a party to the conflict. It's not a neutral arbiter. So they're out.
I disagree with you on that.
And the idea of having Arab armies in the West Bank, well, they're not going to be coming any either. But even if they were, that's hardly reassuring to the Israelis. But they're not coming. What the Palestinians need is a big dose of responsibility. They have to stop. Right the way it is right now, that the worse they behave, the more they get. So they respond rationally to incentives. Behave badly, you get more, and there's never any downside incentive, and no one ever attributes it to them, and they always have lots of excuses.
And you don't see a 41-year occupation as somehow having some effect on Palestinian developments.
I think there has been that Palestinian independence has been available pretty consistently ever since. The Palestinian areas were under Jordanian and Egyptian rule before. Since Israel moved in 1967, independence has been available really at any time.
If independence has been available at any time, why has Israel put 500,000 Israelis over the Green Line?
That has been, as I think your friend Gershom Gorenberg has put it, the unintentional empire. That each year that the Palestinians have failed to take the initiative in making peace, the situation has gotten worse, and there are a lot of domestic pressures.
In 1980, we'll go around in circles like this. I'm not sure where we try and take this onto more constructive ground.
Well, I think let's go back to what you were saying, because my proposal is something that no one's going to do. Almost nobody agrees with me that the initiative here and the responsibility here lie on the Palestinian side, and the international community.
Well, wait a minute. Let's go along with your one. As far as the Americans have defined it, and even as far as the Israelis have defined it, and I'm not part of this, but this is how they've defined it. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank has significantly improved its behavior, its capacity. It's created a more effective security presence in certain areas. Blah blah blah. The response has not been to say, okay, well, we need to now respond in kind. The response has been to continue to expand settlements, to continue the checkpoints. In fact, there are more closures now than there were before, and continue Israeli military raids into the areas where the Palestinians have actually improved the security situation. Now, I don't think that that's because the Israelis are particularly mean or nasty. I think that's structural, and it's to do with an occupation that has to defend civilian settlers. But if we were to go according to your line, right now Israel should be reciprocating for the effective steps forward that everyone recognizes the Palestinian Authority has taken.
Sorry, because I don't see this as a multi-step process. There's really one step. The job here is not to nurture. There are a lot of peoples around the world who would like to have their own independent states. In Afghanistan, there are probably half a dozen. And the job is not to nurture and to say to people who aren't prepared to meet the normal obligations that any state or aspiring state has, but don't seem able or interested to meet them. And the Palestinians need to do one thing, which is to begin by saying, we want to live in peace with our Israeli neighbors, clearly and unequivocally.
But they've said it. But they've said it. They've said it. And when you had a monopolistic Palestinian party saying it, you ignored them. Now you no longer have a monopolistic Palestinian party saying it.
And to say it in a way that is clear and unambiguous.
No, they've said it in ways that are... The batteries run out.
That are subtle and intricate and to be understood by those with ears to hear.
They've said it in ways that...
Because they have to do a job, of educating their own population. And I know you're very interested in the Irish parallel. The great precedent here is what happened in Ireland in 1922 and 1923, when the Irish made the decision to accept not all of the island of Ireland.
But this is what the Palestinians have done on the look. The UN said divided about 55-45. And eventually the Palestinians, now since 49, Israel controlled 78 rather than 55%. And the Palestinians have said yes to 78-22. But, I think what's so difficult for me to comprehend is how the current situation and avoiding making a decision somehow helps Israel or Israel's friends. And that's the thing. If this were a situation where Israel had a capacity to build empire, I would disagree. I would think an empire-building approach to Israel's future, a territorial aggrandizement approach to Israel's future, controlling a non-Jewish majority approach, I would think would be a bad idea, but others could argue that it would be. I just don't think the option exists for Israel. And I think Israel has to be realistic, and therefore Israel has an interest in getting out of there. If Israel has an interest in getting out of there, then I don't think Israel should be setting maximalist, unrealizable preconditions. I think Israel should be looking for practical solutions where Israel can get out of there. Not saying, well, you know what, we actually don't want to get out of here anyway, we want to stay, so you do A, B, C, D, E, fixing a bar at a place that's unrealizable. That's I guess, where it boils down to for me.
Well, in that case, we don't need a peace process at all, then you just get out.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying essentially, Israel can't get out without having some degree of predictability of what goes on in the area.
There's not going to be. That's not going to happen.
Well, I think it's not a binary. I think it's not 100% or 0%. And you're right, I don't think we can create a situation which guarantees 100%, but I think we can go a sufficiently significant step in that direction that Israel has a much greater comfort level with pulling out.
Well, I think, you say there's some. You say a lot of interesting things about that, and leaving me with a lot of questions. The things that Israel can do that would give it a comfort level. Like security wall is an example of that, and other kinds of things to sort of isolate itself. But you're talking in terms of a political process, and the processes you describe. I don't know how realistic you personally really think they are.
I haven't described the entire package that I would recommend is the alternative to an Annapolis-style process. I think they're realistic in terms of that they could be implemented and work pretty well. I'm not sure they're politically realistic in terms of the willingness and the ability of some of the key actors, and especially of an American administration, to give leadership in terms of pulling this package together. I mean, I think it's a package that can probably only be pulled together with US leadership, and that, maybe you'll see the lack of realism in the idea elsewhere, but I think the lack of the ability to do this is most in the role that I would ascribe to an America that may be excessively reluctant or elsewhere focused to play that role.
But so the role you'd have them play is proposing that there be some kind of international security force inside the West Bank and Gaza that would fight. I mean, would they be fighting with Hamas? Would they be fighting with the PA? Would they be in charge of rounding up terrorists? Is that something you can imagine the French or the Poles or the Czechs doing?
Well,
or never mind.
What I envisage, first of all, I think one has to be willing to have the Palestinians resolve some of their own political differences themselves.
You mean kill each other?
Well, I would hope that there would be alternatives to that. There are discussions in Egypt right now. I don't think those are going to bear fruit between Fatah and Hamas. But I think one thing we could constructively do would be to kind of butt out of that conversation rather than define for the Palestinians how they have to. For me, there's a precondition. The precondition is don't use violence. The precondition isn't recognize Israel. Sorry.
So if I'll restate the question and then you can. So if I'm the captain of a French unit in Gaza, what are my responsibilities for the keeping of order?
Okay. First of all, I would that deployment only becomes relevant as part of an overall arrangement which defines a final border in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, as well as in Gaza for Israel and obviously for the Palestinian state that would be established on the other side. The idea is that there would be provisions set up that Israel has agreed to, that the French and the international sponsors have agreed to, and to a degree that the Palestinians and their Arab sponsors have agreed to, as to what the role would be. There would be border crossings. What is allowed in and out of the Palestinian area? Would they be having to deal with things that one's trying to bring in by tunnels? I think there would be monitoring and inspection of what's going on in Gaza in terms of other weapons being brought in. Would they have an active role in going after and dismantling people who are breaking a ceasefire? I think that would have to be decided as to whether that's part of the arrangement or not. Right now, you have a Palestinian capacity to largely deal with not getting the rocket fire out of Gaza. So I think you would have a delineated set of responsibilities, depending on the circumstances. There are circumstances where those responsibilities would be of a more limited nature.
I'm not able to hear very much of that, I'm afraid. We've got a little bit now of the dialogue of the deaf with this new cell line, but I think I can piece it together. But what it seems to me that you're saying is, if we had a genuine Palestinian will to an agreement, then the technicalities of the agreement wouldn't be that difficult.
It's more
right. But in the absence
it's not
of such a willingness, then the technical difficulties become very extreme and important. Where you were going with this a minute ago that I thought was very interesting was that this may be something where there isn't an agreement. We have to accept that the Israelis are going to withdraw, dismantle their settlements, and then they will find their security not through trying to assert it themselves, but through some kind of international force, in effect policing the Palestinians for the Israelis. And that seems difficult enough, but to say, well, that they will only police the area for the Israelis after the Palestinians have agreed to it, that seems even more impossible.
No, I guess I'm saying two things. Number one, that it may be that that Palestinian agreement to this is secondary to an Israeli willingness to leave and to an international, including Arab, willingness to try and fill the vacuum. Not necessarily physically fill the vacuum, although in the case of European and other troops it would be physically. Fill the vacuum that's left behind. I think the main point I'm making, though, is, and I may be wrong on this, and on the rest of it, but would be that by virtue of the act of ending the 67 occupation in reasonable way, you would have a very different reality in the Palestinian territories. And I don't buy the argument that says, but that's what they did in Gaza, because they did it in Gaza while not doing it in the West Bank. And so I think that, and while effectively closing off Gaza from the rest of the world. So I think if there is Palestinian access to the outside world And if the core of the grievance, which is the settlements and the post-67 occupation, is dealt with, then I think you have a very different reality on the Palestinian side. I can understand. What I'm saying is that Israel can't make that move just on a wing and a prayer that I'm right. And therefore Israel has to make that move in the context of also putting in place the best possible mechanism we can, so that if I'm only partially right, or if I'm wrong in key ways, there will be some ability to manage and prevent a chaotic situation in the area that has been deoccupied by Israel. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Well, we're at 58 minutes, and I was only able to hear about 1 out of 3 of those past words. So I think that's going to mean I can't comment on them, which means you get the last word.
That's how I designed this system. No.
So this may be actually a very useful repertoire in your piece processing, is to have more volume control, so that people have to say, "Well, I'll just assume you agreed with what I just said."
I shall carry this phone with me preciously from now on.
All right, good to talk to you.
Take care. Thanks. Bye bye.